Let me introduce to you Colm O'Neill. Colm is a designer and researcher. His work deals with digital literacy, the notion of control, I would say, in relation to digital technology, and more specifically in relation to graphic user interfaces. And maybe more broadly, means of mediation that come with those interfaces. In the larger context and discourse around digital images, graphic user interfaces take, as we encounter them, often rather modest presence. It's usually not something that you worry about or that you get confronted with necessarily. So interfaces are presented to us as mediators rather than dominators or controllers. However, it is those visual smooth curtains that are mediating our first encounters with technology and our experience with it. And they're often very persuasive and intuitive, so we don't really tend to question them much. And Colm is doing or did a really interesting research on this issue, and will tell us a little bit more about why we might need to look through those curtains and start questioning them. I'm very much looking forward. Thanks, Colm, for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to come here and speak with all of you. I think I just should begin a tiny bit by contextualizing. That intro was really great already to put some things in space or in a certain line, but this work, this research is, let's say, not my usual practice. I'm a graphic designer. I let's say, practice mostly web design and web development on a daily basis. This is like sort of my day job. But this research came part of, or was sort of the outcome of a master's I did that finished last year at the Piet Art Institute here in Rotterdam, well, here in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. I'm based in Brussels, so I did the back and forth there for 2 years at that time. So I bring up the kind of everyday job because it really informed what my interests were, or how I undertook my research at the Piet. Mostly because my work as a graphic designer and web developer is actually kind of one of sort of a tool curator. This isn't a term I made up, I borrowed it off somebody, but let's say that in a sort of realm of different people, different users, different makers, in sort of the stack of what software is, I kind of put myself in the middle. I'm not, let's say, an only end user, although I am very often simply an end user of software. I'm also not really a pure developer, so to say. I'm kind of in between of like using things that other people have published and selecting them for different people I work with and for, and so trying to understand what they might need for their websites, their, I don't know, file management or this sort of thing. And so that's why I borrow the word curator or tool curator. And in that context, I've kind of been confronted a lot with this kind of large word that I'm going to say now, and I'm going to try and take it apart as we go along, but of digital literacy, of different people having different needs and understanding that our organization needs a website, or my project needs a website, can you help out? Apparently that's what you do, and it's like, yeah, of course, but then we start talking about what actually needs to be done materially, physically, in terms of like infrastructure of just simply selecting tools, selecting servers, domain names, like basic web development things. And I say basic, and it's already on a bias because that's kind of normal for me in my practice. But I feel like the knowledge or the ability for the people I work with to understand what this infrastructure is actually slowly like becoming harder, and I don't think it's their fault. I don't think it's the end user's fault. I say they, but I mean collectively us, maybe. The way in which we get access to these tools, to these technology, to these really tools is not necessarily made in such a way that lets us pass this sort of wall of the interface. So in that context, the title of this talk is Adversarial Interfaces, and I thought I'd take you through different steps in the process that kind of led me to this, specifically taking one element apart that I think is quite interesting. The other quick sort of introduction kind of note I need to put forward is that a lot of my work and research is informed by a collective I work with in Brussels called Open Source Publishing. I put a slide here of the website we use. It's a non-profit. It's in existence for almost 10 years now. It'll be 10 years in a few months. I've only been part of the collective for about 4 years, a bit more than that, but a lot of my work is influenced by being around the people of OSP. There's between 7 and 9, depending on the time of year. Currently I'm a bit stepping back from OSP, but this is only, it's like this a bit with everybody. And so in the title is this idea of open source, and you'll see that a lot of my work is kind of, we could be talking about interfaces in lots of different contexts, but I chose to stay within interfaces that we all have access to, whatever the brand of phone or laptop you use. I specifically look at the languages on the web as a kind of a sort of way of being all-inclusive and also sort of abiding to something that we can all literally access. So you'll see sort of influences of open source. I obviously don't have time to dive into this too much, but it's really important for me to mention it because I've gained so much from the collective, and it's obviously a lot bigger than me, so it's there as an introductory kind of notice. So to dive in, there are several parts, several different dimensions that kind of led me to build or to more like land on this idea around adversarial interfaces. But the first one, and coming back to a little bit of this problem of the way in which the end users may be able to acquire knowledge of the systems they are using when they are using the web, comes with this idea of modes of address. Like, what I mean with modes of address is literally the way I could be addressing you now, the way we address each other in the street, the way a conference might address you in a way, the way an event, the way a message addresses you, the way signs address you. And so kind of as a graphic designer, this is an interesting question on its own. But I've seen it take a kind of a form, literally the language of modes of address, the ways in which language is put forward on the web lately has become quite problematic to me. And I'll show you a few examples of what I mean, because I'm pretty sure most of you have encountered things like this. So I've selected some kind of weird examples. I just want to take them apart a little bit with you. They're mostly screenshots of different things I've come across, and you might have different experiences, but this is something that comes to me from just a hosting service I use. It's called DigitalOcean. It's pretty flashy, like you would say, pretty modern user interface. It's a fine service, let's say, but every now and then they're putting in a new product, and they introduce me to that when I log into the dashboard, and this was one of them that said, introducing monitoring, and so it sort of explains the broad lines of a new product, which may or may not interest me as a user of their thing. My concern is mostly with this big blue button up there. It's the word, like, awesome. It's not like I have never said the word awesome. It's not just one it's just not really one I use very often. The thing is that I mean, this is my only exit for this. If I'm lucky, maybe the people that put in place this message also activated the escape key to make this message disappear. But if it's not the case, my only exit sort of from this thing to acknowledge this message is effectively me clicking a button that makes me say the word awesome back to DigitalOcean. It's like, okay, well, I'm being a bit rough, but this is kind of a pattern that's beginning. If I show you some other examples, this is a screenshot from tumblr.com, and I checked, actually, they still have this introduction. I don't know if, I suppose most of you are familiar with Tumblr, but just to say it's sort of like a blogging service with an internal community where you can internally follow blogs, but mostly it makes blogs, basically. They have this kind of one screen or single screen kind of presentation when you're signing up for an account to tumblr.com. You get to it and it's got like these 4 or 5 panels that take you through the different parts of what Tumblr is and how it works. And the first one begins with a sentence that goes along the lines of, Tumblr is so easy that it's actually hard to explain. It's so easy to use that it's actually hard to explain. And then they kind of unpack it through these like couple of pretty well animated different slides to show you how you follow people, how the system actually works, how you post content. And then you get to this final big message that says, okay, it's not actually hard to explain. we lied, but now you understand how this works, so come on in. And again, I know I'm nitpicking a little bit, but this kind of message is a bit weird to me, why a company of the size of Tumblr with the kind of ambitions they have would choose such a way to express themselves. And obviously you've got to think of like, well, this is how they just choose to market themselves, and that's pretty obvious, and I think that throughout the things I'm going to speak about this evening, that's going to be kind of omnipresent, but just this is weird to me, and as part of the collections of examples, I think this has its place, because the kind of tongue-in-cheek attitude that's portrayed here has a function, and I'm going to propose one of the reasons I think this type of language exists in a few seconds, but it's notable the way that this is sort of put in place that way. And then this is one that you may or may not have encountered more and more often lately. So there are these ad blockers that you might use with your browser. And then there are these ways now that major websites put in place the detection of you using an ad blocker. And the language here, again, is pretty interesting to me. So, again, when I was saying earlier about putting forward sort of the language, the marketing language that Tumblr chooses to use, again, this is sort of an economic question, and clearly there is a need or a place for ads online, but the fact is that when this comes up in this form of language, it seems like the decision that I chose to install ad blockers on my browser kind of is renegated, like it's not allowed. It's become like really frowned upon, and I should feel bad about doing it, and it's sort of a moral that's put forward onto me, like, here's the thing with ad blockers, like it's really moralistic tone, like let me take you to the corner and explain what's actually going on when you do this. But we're also talking about Wired.com in this case, so I think it's a bit like, come on, you know, it's I think I'm allowed, and maybe some of your content doesn't show up, or maybe some of the page breaks, but this is kind of pretty aggressive, and it happens more and more often these days. So I don't know, it's just pointing out a bit of the customizable part of your browsing experience that you should be able to do, because it's things that you run on your own computer, you choose to go visit it in many ways, and suddenly this sort of content wall is put up. Again, the language here is really my kind of interest. It's like, here's the thing with ad blockers. Again, a kind of message like the first one we looked at, which appeared once I was logging into Twitter, and this thing kind of happens quite a lot, in which an update in user policy or some sort of document that I've obviously previously signed when signing up to Twitter comes up, gets updated, and I need to get my consent again. I need to get our consent as users. So the message on top is kind of pretty weird, because it's all about like how Twitter uses my data. So I do have the option of reviewing my settings, but the option that's sort of suggested in a design language, or the button that's highlighted first, is the button sounds good. And in actual fact, I think I should be able to answer other things. It's a bit like the word awesome earlier. I wish I was able to answer other things, you know? I wish I was able to... Probably I will acknowledge this, because I don't have much choice, right? And at the end of the day, I do want to access Twitter, and I've accepted 100,000 different, like, horrible legal binding documents, like I'm sure you have as well, agreeing to all these different circumstances and the ways in which platforms will use the data I generate when I'm on there. I just wish I had other ways of responding to such a message, as opposed to just, sounds good. It's like, whatever. Like, yeah, you just changed your policy, and it's probably not good for me not good. In my opinion, it wasn't good for my usage, or it wasn't something that I would actually say sounds good to, basically. So it's really just this word again, but it's highlighted in sort of words being put in my mouth, or through my click, but like, it's effectively me saying, it sounds good, it's fine, whatever, do whatever you like. So to put forward a kind of an idea as to why this may be, this informal mode of address, this sort of method of talking, and I say tongue-in-cheek again because of the Tumblr thing, but it's a phenomenon that has been happening, and it's not, let's say, brand new, but it's in existence, and it's kind of, I think it's become more and more common to see this sort of way in which platforms might express themselves to their users. So in this text by William Davis, he proposes that actually maybe the function of this super common, super friendly, super local kind of language is a bit of a function of erosion. It's an erosion of a boundary between like the different personas that we might have online. And like we use the internet, we use our different web services for all sorts of different types of things. Some might be professional, some will be clearly more personal. But in using a sort of common, sort of personalized language or sort of familiar language, Davis proposes that actually maybe the function of this is really to sort of like lower our defense mechanisms. If the platforms are speaking to us in, I realize the problematics of saying like the platforms as a large, but more like if we think back at the examples I was showing, those platforms, the way they're talking to us, maybe it has a function of really kind of breaking down the boundaries between what we consider our personal personas and our public personas online, and the different types of things that we might address differently when logging in and out of different, I don't know, professional versus personal email accounts, or logging in and out of different kind of personas we might have on our Instagram accounts, Facebook, if we're managing different kind of programs, if we're responsible for group activities. So this is a quote from that text. It's an article from 2016, I think, so it's not very old. It was published on Real Life magazine. It's, for me, pretty key for taking apart this sort of language, and I draw off of it a lot. He also proposes in this text a sort of idea around this rhetorical turn. So, in what I was trying to say, and also what Davis puts in place, there's a revealing kind of aspect of the language that's used, which is kind of the politics of this company, this platform, this product, this way they use the language for their marketing, or this way they use the language to maybe indeed erode the boundaries between different personas we have to better exploit our data, is also happening through these sorts of rhetorical turns. And these are examples that you might have also encountered, but as they're put perfectly in place by Davis, I just used his bit of text that actually points out like the way in which we might sign up to a platform as a real direct address of how the platform is speaking to us, and puts forward the examples of, for example, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago we would have signed up to a platform that needed our date of birth, and they would have asked us for a date of birth. These days we sign up to platforms and they're like, help me celebrate your birthday. It's a very different kind of address. It's a very different kind of way of talking to me. And it's also like, oh, well, cool, they're going to send me a nice, well, it's like, are they going to send me a nice gift on my birthday? Or is it, you kind of wonder what it's for. There's a couple of other examples up there, but the two particular ones that Davis put forward, I won't have time to go into this, but particularly he points out the placeholders in status boxes on the main social network websites as being particularly interesting. So basically that last line, when Twitter asks us Facebook asks how are you, as a way of kind of inviting you to express, it's an interesting bit of sort of discardable language, but that holds a lot of meaning for how the platform intends itself to be used and what they want to actually get out of us. So this is where the talk kind of accelerates a tiny bit, because that was kind of something that I was looking into a lot, and I wanted to take it a bit apart to introduce kind of one of the strands that led me to this research project that I'm going to get to at the end. And so up on the screen are maybe other kind of notions or concepts of interface practices that aren't so linked to modes of address, but kind of they are. But I kind of allowed myself to put them in a big list here together, because I believe that these concepts are slightly more commonplace, or a bit more common these days. So, for example, the idea of seamless interfaces. And actually it was really nice that in the webpage advertising the event tonight that you picked the video of this kind of compilation of the word seamless being put in context of software all the time. And like, the problems that I see with this might not be problems that you see, or we clearly have different kind of points of view simply because of the kind of software I choose to use, and I think it's really important to continue having a kind of large ecology of different types of platforms and types of software that will, in certain cases, stimulate seamlessness or want seamlessness, and then my kind of attitude, which is like very hands-on kind of, I want to know what's going on and I want to be able to launch all my applications separately. But this idea of seamless interfaces is kind of like just simply how many, well, not how many, but more like, is it possible to make a seamless kind of transition for the user between two different types of apps, be it bringing content over, be it like making them interact. So aside from this idea of seamless interfaces, I also notice the trend of, far from a trend, I shouldn't use that word, the sort of practice these days of like the separation or maybe the multiplication of different types of practices within user interface designs. It might have been that, I don't know how long ago again, but like a designer would have taken on the task of designing a website. And now we talk about all these different types of titles: experience designer, user experience designer, user interface designers, and I actually had to kind of, it feels like I lengthened this list, but these are really all different titles that are used like on platforms like LinkedIn. They're all separate kind of tasks apparently, but I think it was important to put that forward as like these tasks are clearly thought about actively. And finally, I borrow a kind of a tiny schematic from Olia Lialina, who kind of noted a slight other type of language shift in which we kind of slowly substituted the word computer for the word technology, the word interface for the word experience, and the word user for people. And kind of putting these in relation to what I was trying to show about modes of address, I think is all like pretty important to keep in mind for the context I'm going to try and put forward, or the sort of place I'm putting forward to continue this research or staying with it. Because these four aspects, and also the way, there are plenty others that could build this image, but what I'm I suppose a bit afraid of, or I suppose I'm a bit concerned with, is a logic of totality. Now, totality is kind of a hard thing to describe properly, but let's say that in most cases it's a kind of an idea used to represent things or to speak about things from a critical aspect, for example, of capitalism. It's sort of a system in which you can't see the outside of, or you can't seem to imagine the outside of this system. I think all the points that I was putting forward of the mode of address, seamless interface, is this kind of breaking up or multiplication of different design tasks, this shifts in languages, might actually build up this kind of idea, or continue building this idea of the web as a totalized space, or our digital environments as totalized spaces. And I mean by that it's impossible to kind of be on the outside of them, or break out of them, or to consider like alternative forms of them. And of course that's wrong, and even using the word totality is like problematic, because in even the context of speaking about capitalism, people have written very important books that say you can't allow yourself to define things as totalities, or you're basically fucking yourself up and denying yourself the possibility of obtaining the thing that you're critical about. But I still put it forward because this is kind of what I'm fearful of, mostly thinking back to the people I try and work with, who are basically end users and who don't have necessarily the time that I have to go in and dig in and like spend time changing operating system and like dig in and find other types of softwares. A lot of people, I'm thinking of like my direct relations and people I work with, just get presented with these really well-made seamless interfaces, and it's pretty easy to just think, well, that's the environment that I'm allowed to interact with the web with, and that's it. And getting out of it is an impossible kind of thing, because it's impossible to know where to start and you wouldn't know how to approach it, and it builds an idea of a totality. And this is kind of the fearful point, but luckily there have been many other people that have been thinking about this before me, and as part of this research that's been ongoing, or that was at its full speed at the end of the degree I did last year, there are a lot of texts out there that help us think critically about these sorts of systems. Again, in the format of today, it's hard to dive into all the different influences of what I'm going to end up on in the end, but it's a good a time as any to mention that this title, this talk, Adversarial Interfaces, actually takes material form. Can you say that? It takes form in a website, and it's online, and it has a section of sort of theoretical texts. I just mean to say that because I'm only going to have time to really look into the key one, but there's a lot of other things that inform this decision to go and name the project in this way. So the key texts, along maybe with Davis's text, William Davis's text, is a textbook called the Salvo text. It's a book, it's a standalone book, and a pretty hefty body of work at that. But adversarial design is a sort of, it's a full method of thinking about design that de Salvo put forward. Was it 2014? I think it was, yeah, if it wasn't 2014, it was just before that, but about 5 years ago. And in this book he proposes adversarial design as a way of thinking about the kind of politics that design objects might hold within themselves. And mostly what he puts forward is sort of this method of thinking through the politics that these objects might express and propose agonism to them. So these are his words, and I know it's a bit of a long definition, but basically de Salvo calls adversarial design design that does the work of agonism, which is this political theory that basically says it would be interesting if we can continue to imagine spaces in which there can be dissensus. I'm really simplifying, but it's essentially this Chantal Mouffe theory, or this sort of idea that she put forward, agonism, which is really just maybe in some circumstances the existence of conflict in certain political situations is interesting and should be stimulated as simply a way to think about how we interact with one another, how we live together, how different aspects of our politics and of our societies are built. So de Salvo puts this forward, and the text is really, the chapters of the book are really fantastic in the way he actually uses examples of designed objects, and in some ways, some of them are, you could call them industrial design objects, but also a lot of them take the forms of like outcomes of workshops that he simply he doesn't title anything literally adversarial design, or it's not a label or like a sticker or anything, it's more like a way in which he proposes a way of thinking through it. And when I started reading this text during my full run of research, I really had a way of finally breathing a little bit, because I could see that, and you've maybe noticed that I was kind of circumventing all this kind of acknowledgement of what the politics of all these softwares are. It's so much to take on, be it just simply marketing language, or actual data usage policies, or maybe even darker things behind that, between, I don't know, tracking cross websites. I mean, there's a lot to take apart, and it's complicated, and it doesn't involve a single politic. There's no right or wrong answer. And I think it's important that we can debate things like the need for advertising online and these stuff of that order. To take an easy example, in the research I also took time to really dive deep into, for example, cookie messages, the messages that websites put forward to kind of get us to agree to their cookie policy. And we see it a lot lately with data protection. There are several examples of this, these laws being put in place and these interesting texts being put forward. But I had a real deep breath of air when I found adversarial design, because it was this is a way that actually a lot of different things can be dealt with in simple steps. And I had to try it on my issues that I was having, or my research body that I was building around interfaces. And so I simply slapped the two words together and kind of got to this idea of adversarial interfaces, where I sort of started applying de Salvo's ideas that he applied to design, but to interfaces. And interfaces, again, is kind of like this massive word that all on its own is not standalone, but I really mean them in the kind of ways I was putting forward at the beginning of the talk. So adversarial interfaces takes form of a site which has this URL that's up here, adversarialinterfaces.site or .spaces. And on it I basically allow myself to continue thinking this way. There are no good answers, there are no easy ways of getting out of it, but getting out of it, it's really hard to be specific. I mean specifically to take time to address the different complexities of the different politics we may or may not agree with when we encounter these different things online. But this frame of thoughts has really helped me sort of place boundaries and distinguish things, and actually start thinking of actually what, how adversarial interfaces or how adversarial design can actually maybe come and answer my initial question, which was, well, not really initial question, but my initial concern of actually maybe if some of the interface design that we would employ a bit more often, then maybe adversarial interfaces could come and reinform end users of the systems that lie beneath the interfaces, the projects, the tools, the everything online that they use. So I've got a couple of examples of things. I selected 5, and I'm running kind of close to the end of my time, but I think, unfortunately, these first 2, I was finishing this presentation in the train on the way up, and the links I had were both dead, so I'm going to have to check them. But I selected the first one because I just think it just is such a good way of simply, like, I mean, also because it really pissed me off when I started seeing the messages, like I saw the one on Wire that I showed you earlier, of here's the thing with ad blockers. We have now ways, again, with other more complex but more powerful browser extensions to actually anticipate when a website will try and anticipate us having an ad blocker. So it's called Anti-Ad Block Killer, which might not be the best name, but there's a project that exists as a web extension that actually works really well at actually being able to circumvent the situation. It's kind of like 3-step situation. And it's pretty great, mostly because of the community of people that come together to flag these different websites that say, hey, I got a notification, or I got a problem when I use my ad blocker on this website. And I think in this way, I mean, it's a very specific area of the politics I'm concerned with within interfacing practices, but Anti-Ad Block Killer really comes and answers a direct question. There's another one called Clickbait Stopper, which again, the function it delivers is interesting in one way, but even more interesting to me is the people that dialogue around what different clickbait words are in use these days. And so there's this kind of really impressive list. I think it touches around 1,700 words now. I might be wrong about that, but there's this list of words that have been graded by different people to say this word in context might be a bit more clickbaity than you want it. And so you can choose to, through this browser extension, either black it out entirely, have it visible but cross through so that you keep on having this vision of like what can be considered a clickbait word. Is this article really what it says it is on the title, or is this just a subtle construction of a title that's going to bring me in? There's this other project here beneath that is kind of leaving the world of interfaces, but not really. I'll just open this because it's the best way to show it to you. This work by Silvio Lorusso, I think is a couple of years old, 2016. It takes a sentence from a type of software that he qualifies, well, that is qualified, but Silvio puts it really well, called Nannyware. Like, there's loads of types of different softwares, but there's like one specific type that's been looked at that's like Nannyware. And different types of Nannyware would be, for example, if you've ever tried to put your Android phone on maximum volume, there's a little pop-up that says, oh, you should be careful and not pass, I don't know how much it is, 75% of your phone's maximum possible output to not damage your ears. Or the Nintendo Wii had a very famous one, which is like, should you take a break and go outside? These sorts of different things. This extension, this browser extension, I actually forget its original name, would actually try and get you to concentrate again, would acknowledge like how distracting the web could be, and every so often it would let you kind of fall back. It would let you it would observe the kind of activity you have on your laptop. It would let you go do a couple of minutes of social media work or whatever, be away from the website or the programs that you had told it to monitor properly. It would pop up a little, shouldn't you be working? Which is pretty aggressive in some ways, but I suppose you also installed it. And Silvio took apart this thing and started printing these messages and putting them kind of on everything. Oh, it's called Stay Focused. So he started printing these out, and then as he distributed them, people started really taking them to task and putting them on mirrors and lunchboxes and looking out a window, or why are you looking at the back of my laptop, or are you allowed to eat now? So I think this is just, it's been helpful as well. Yeah. It's a really, really nice project, and just pretty simple shift of if you take this thing that we allow on our screens out of its context and you do it in the real world, it's ridiculous. you wouldn't really ever try and do this. So in that way, I suppose this is maybe one of the examples that I look at in the same way that De Salvo looks at different examples of like, well, this is kind of an interfacing practice, or it's like a method of speech that comes through an interface. But if you think about it in the context of adversarial interfaces, of something that could do the work of agonism, that exists simply purely to express the needs of multiple opinions on these sorts of subjects, then it becomes really interesting to kind of consider even interfaces that I wouldn't want to use myself. Oops, which way am I going? The problem with going full screen. I must have been, here, no, here, no. Sorry, I'm lost in. Okay. Well, this way you see the actual website, and you can see that actually the slides that I'm using are online. We can quickly go through a lot, because there's two last links of things I could show you maybe. If it's okay, I think I'm a bit over time, but I'll quickly show them. I think this example of a type of a plugin that Joanna Moll puts forward is really another interesting way of dealing with what could be an adversarial interface. It's a simple, tiny little button on the corner of the websites that she makes that simply puts forward, that reveals sort of the weights of a web page, that puts it in parallel with a library that's supposed to be able to interpret how much electricity it needed to get to you on your browser that day. I think this example could be, again, another way of expressing to end users actually what the mechanics, what the actual infrastructures of the web are. And very similarly, in my last slide, this example of a project that appeared a couple of months ago, I think is really nice. The Low Tech magazine had a redesign of their website recently, and they decided to really embody low tech in a way that I think is really interesting. First of all, by addressing all the different ways in which the resources of the websites were managed, but mostly because their server is now autonomous in a way that one of the main writers of, from what I understand, one of the main writers of the Low Tech magazine lives in Barcelona and is able to have a solar panel and a web server on a terrace that he has access to, and they run the website from this solar panel. So when you visit the low tech website, you've got this battery status. It's pretty freaky to be on a website and think, oh, there's only 5% left. What does that actually mean? It's not my battery, it's not my internet, it's nothing to do with me, but it says 5%, and it's like, what does that actually mean? And they speak about it extensively. It's a really, really nice project, but it means that eventually you'll try and go and it's offline. So there are a few examples of what I mean by adversarial interfaces. Again, it's kind of like a thing I'm keeping active, keeping on the back burner as a way of thinking through my issues that can come up through different types of interface designs or interface practices. So, as I said, there are more details on the website and more different kind of examples. I mentioned the things about cookies. They're also sort of there's a larger theoretical scaffold that really helped me put this all together. But I'll stop there because I'm way over time now. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Colm. Are there any questions?
What's the name of the website? Is this all out?
It's a Low Tech Mag, I think, the URL, but we can check it. Maybe it's not online. It's offline, but that's the URL, solar.lowtechmag. They're still moving to it. They're having trouble trying to find the appropriate batteries and things, but it's super well documented and it's really impressive work.
I have a question, because sometimes we talk about this adversarial interfaces in the way that it's like a lens, like a way of looking at things and analyzing them, discerning them, and understanding them. And sometimes we talk about it as if it's a thing, as if it's you can actually make adversarial interfaces. And my preference goes to the first one, not because I don't want adversarial interface to exist, but more because I think there's so little like critical design theory and reflection on processes of design. And I feel like a lot what you addressed in terms of interface and all these experience design processes addresses habits much more than objects. So I feel like it maybe looking at end results and analyzing end results with the lens of adversarial interface doesn't do justice to what is actually at stake. I think it's much more about how we interact, how did we end up here in this relation? Why do I have a personal computer that's really just looking at me rather than at the collective, you know? Or so I don't know, it's not a question.
No, but actually it's part of, when I was trying to like formulate or reformulate this thing, I did attempt, like I thought, well, what would be the answer to the question of can I make an adversarial interface myself? And I made some experiments, but to be honest, they weren't that fruitful. I made different kind of browser extensions that I thought could play off of different types of metrics that aren't exploited or used, or maybe they're not, maybe they are. I thought, for example, I built for a while a thing I called the scrollometer, which is an extension that would calculate in like normal human measures, centimeters, meters, how much you had scrolled that day, or how much different types of scrolling, like what distance of scrolling you would do on each website, and put them kind of all together and congratulate you if you made a mile of web page that day, this sort of thing. And you kind of see it's a bit humoristic, but it's also not an adversarial interface. It kind of exists as it was a bit of an attempt to try and like maybe use these metrics in an unusual way, but it falls apart pretty quickly. Yeah, it's become more of a search for adversarial interfaces as opposed to like how can I probe spaces to make ones.
Yeah. But maybe the thing is that it cannot exist as a finished thing. Like it has to stay within a process or like something that acknowledges its like bigger implications beyond. Yeah,
I think that's probably why the solar project of the Low Tech magazine is so nice, because I don't think they ever thought it wasn't their purpose. They really were like, we're making a solar-powered, battery-powered server, and we need to just tell people about it. And it's indeed then a lens that I can maybe come and look at things with or on that kind of continues this thing, I suppose. Lets it happen.
Yes, but then, I would like to thank you very much, Colm, for sharing this research with us. It's very important input also for the next 2 days workshop. And then I would say we have like, how much time do we have? Do we have time for something?
Phew.
We're aiming at rounding up and closing at around 10. Please stick around until then. Thanks all for coming out.
Thank you.